Good evening, everyone. I'm Bridget Hall of the Neurological Foundation, and welcome to everyone tonight. It's wonderful to see you all here, and a special welcome to Professor Hachinski to the most beautiful part of New Zealand. We may be a wee bit biased, but welcome. Professor Hachinski is Distinguished University Professor of Neurology at Western University, founding chairman of the International Society for Vascular, Behavioural and Cognitive Disorders, and past president of the World Federation of Neurology. He pioneered the first successful acute stroke unit globally, and this model has become the international standard. We're thrilled that Professor Hachinski has been able to take time out of his busy schedule to present to us tonight. Professor Hachinski will talk for an hour, and then I'll open up the floor for questions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hachinski.
Thank you, Bridget. Bridget, Dragana, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to the Neurological Foundation for inviting me. From what I've seen in New Zealand, I would agree with your assessment. This is the most beautiful part. People ask me, where are you from? I say, London. They said, London? Well, London, Ontario, near Toronto. What I'm going to do is tell you about stroke and dementia. And then I'm going to discuss how we're approaching it now, what are some of the emerging realities are, and then suggest that maybe we can do better than we're doing. And the reason I say that is that 1 in 3 of us will end up with a stroke, dementia, or both, unless we improve prevention and treatment. The main reason why the percentage of stroke and Alzheimer's disease and other dementia is increasing is that overall the age of the population of the world is increasing. That everyone knows. What people are less aware of, that at the same time that there's an increase in the number of older people, there is a smaller proportion of children. By the year 2017, the number of individuals over the age of 65 will be equal to the number of children under 5. And thereafter, the number of older people will continue to grow while the number of children will decrease. This has practical importance. It takes 6 working people to support 1 retiree. In Canada, we're beginning to lose that battle. There's only 4.5 working people for each retiree, and the problem is going to get worse. Now, there are 3 things that can be done. The first one is to remove retirement ages, to allow people to work for as long as they can and they wish. And that has been done. The second one is to aim to increase the number of new Canadians. Luckily, Canada is a favorite destination for people, and we certainly could increase the number of new Canadians. Where we're not doing very well is in the local production of Canadians. It takes 2.1 children on average per couple to maintain the population in equilibrium. At the moment, the ratio in Canada is 1.69. So someone has said that Canadians of childbearing age should have 3 children. 1 for father, 1 for mother, and 1 for Canada. Now, I'm going to use some terms, and I want to make sure that when I use the terms, you understand what I mean precisely. Stroke is the sudden loss of brain function, such as speaking, seeing, moving, or feeling a limb, due to a blockage of an artery or a burst of a blood vessel. Dementia is the global loss of cognitive function that impairs self-sufficiency, difficulty in memory, difficulty in reasoning, difficulty in problem solving. And Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia which is characterized by progressive loss of memory and later on by all other important brain functions. Now, I want to go over the common causes of stroke, first of all. There are two main types of strokes. About 80% of strokes are due to what we call ischemia, the blockage of an artery. And then the part of the artery that irrigates a section of the brain, if that artery is closed, then that part that it is irrigating will die. And that's called an ischemic infarct. That's the majority. And then 20% will be due to a rupture of a blood vessel, typically on an artery. And one of them is a blood vessel itself, usually due to high blood pressure, or what we call subarachnoid hemorrhage. Subarachnoid hemorrhage is usually a bleb, an aneurysm on an artery that then bursts, and a lot of the blood goes around the brain. That's why it's called subarachnoid, because the brain is covered by a membrane called arachnoid membrane. In terms of what causes ischemic stroke, there are three main causes. One, if you have a clot coming from the heart, and the common condition that leads to this is called AFib, atrial fibrillation. And this is increasingly common with increasing age. And the good news is that there's treatment for it. We've had a warfarin or Coumadin, an anticoagulant since 1948, and more recently there have been 4 new types of anticoagulants that allow people to take it daily without having to check their blood. The second main type is due to atherosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries. And typically there is narrowing of the arteries of the neck, and this may lead to the symptoms that I described in my definition of stroke. And finally, it could be due to the occlusion of small vessels that have been made thick and brittle by high blood pressure. And those are called small infarcts, lacunar infarcts. Those are the 3 main categories. That accounts for about 90% of all types of stroke. Of course, as you may know, strokes occur at any age, even before people are born. As a number of the cases of called cerebral palsy are really intrauterine strokes. And there are a number of other causes that can happen in children and adolescents, during pregnancy. It spares no age. It's an important condition. But I'll be mainly referring to the 3 types that I've described, because these tend to occur later in life, at which time strokes and dementia are much more common. Now, this is a brain of Alzheimer's disease, and what it shows you is that a lot of the brain has shrunk because many of the neurons, the cells of the brain, have died, and hence there is less volume to the brain. And when the brain is examined, the typical lesions are called senile plaques, and it's the clumping of an abnormal protein called A beta, or amyloid A beta. And the other hallmark is another clumped protein called tau, T-A-U. And the deposition of these 2 abnormal proteins are thought to characterize what we call Alzheimer's disease. Now, how we are approaching stroke, Alzheimer's disease, and the other dementias? What are we doing now? Well, I believe that we're spending too much time at the end stages. In other words, In Alzheimer's disease, it takes 20 years before the first molecular mischief and the first symptoms. Then it takes 5 years from the first symptoms to a full dementia. And most of our efforts are at the end stage. We have memory clinics. By the time you have memory disorder, it's not necessarily Alzheimer's disease. And I'll comment on this in a minute. But if it's a serious memory problem, then oftentimes it is a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, and therefore, at that stage, there is little we can do. So clearly, we must begin much earlier, and we must change our efforts from the late stages to the early stages. Now, Hippocrates already, the father of medicine, 2,000 years ago, said that it is a greater virtue to keep the brain healthy than then to try to cure it once it is ill. And I don't think Hippocrates would be proud of us. In Britain, where dementia is the costliest condition, costlier than heart disease, costlier than stroke, costlier than cancer, only 0.1 of the money spent in dementia in Britain is dedicated to prevention. We must do more, not only in Britain, but elsewhere in the world, if we're going to make a difference. Secondly, stroke and Alzheimer's disease often occur together, but they're studied apart. This is the price of specialization. People know more and more about less and less until they know almost everything about almost nothing. And there are very few people who dare try to go from one field to the other and try to sort of build bridges. You get shot at from both sides. I know. I began as a stroke doctor. I'm invading the Alzheimer people. I get shot from both sides. Bridget said that John Noyes and I started the first successful stroke kit in the world. And that was a great thing. And now they say, that Professor Hachinski, now he's doing cognition. Dementia? Is he all right? And then the Alzheimer people said, isn't he a stroke doctor? But anyway, I take comfort in something that Churchill said. There's nothing more exhilarating than being shot at and missed. And so far, I'm writing. And the third thing is that if you look at the efforts that we make in stroke and in Alzheimer's disease and dementia, we spend a lot of time diagnosing and not enough treating and preventing. We have to shift again, in my opinion, more efforts towards doing something now. 1 in 3 of us will end up with a stroke, dementia, both. Gosh, I have a vested interest. I'm in the same category as you are. We have to change the ratio. We have to change the odds. I think this just has had a stroke. It doesn't work. Let me see what I do need help because the computer doesn't do it either. Well, let me then go on to say, okay, so I can criticize what we're doing now, but what is it that I'm saying that we could do better? Well, it turns out that based on 6,205 autopsies carried out in the United States, if you take all types of dementia, and I'll just give you 2 examples. One is called frontotemporal dementia, which is less common than Alzheimer's disease, and that often leads to behavioral changes. People begin acting in a very abnormal way, inappropriately, and eventually cannot cope. They're socially outcast because of their behavior, and that's called frontotemporal dementia. And Alzheimer's disease are already defined. It turns out if you take all types of dementia, then they all have a vascular component. They have a vascular disease of the brain. They don't necessarily have a stroke, but they have vascular disease of the brain, ranging from 60% in the frontotemporal dementias to 80% in Alzheimer's disease. And the importance of this is that we know how to treat vascular disease. And in this, and it turns out that most people who have had a stroke don't know it. Now, Why do I say that? Because for each stroke that we know about, this type of stroke that takes people to hospital, there are 6 that happen silently without people being aware. And these little strokes do not affect the body, they affect the mind. They're subtle thieves of mind. And it turns out by the age of 63, 1 in 10 individuals will have one of these little strokes. Most of them don't cause a lot of harm because the brain can compensate for them. But if you combine them with the amyloid deposition that I alluded to before, then that's a dangerous combination. And it's working. All right. This is just to show you that at age 55, of the people who end up with dementia, 55% of them have a vascular component. By the age of 83, 83% of them have a vascular component. So clearly, there's a major vascular component we can treat and prevent. This is my main point. It's time we did it systematically. Now, we know that with increasing age, there's more Alzheimer's disease and there are more strokes. So are they simply fellow travelers or are they partners in crime? I'm going to argue that they're partners in crime. The strong evidence for this is a study that was done in the United States called the NUN study. And there was 100% donation of the brains of the nuns when they died. So it's a very good study in that nuns tend to have the same lifestyle. So they tend to work the same, they tend to eat the same, they have the same environment. So in some ways, it's a very good study because we're controlling for extraneous factors. They in terms of what they did and what they ate was similar. So when they looked at the brains of the nuns and said they have the pathological, the autopsy diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, only 57% of the nuns had any difficulty in life. If in addition they had a stroke in the cortex, in other words, the rind of the brain, then 75% of them did have difficulty in life. And then, strangely enough, if they had one or more of those little strokes I told you about, that don't necessarily make people aware of it, then 93% of them did. So based on that, my colleague David Chiquetto and I developed an animal model to study this interaction. And we found that, I want you to concentrate on the bottom part, which has these black and gray columns. We found that if we produced a stroke in the presence of amyloid, remember amyloid is one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, then the volume of the damage was greater as compared to control animals that were healthy animals. And instead of shrinking, as it did in the control animals, it actually grew in volume. And if you looked at inflammation, then the inflammation was greater in the presence of amyloid, in other words, Alzheimer's disease in animals. And instead of settling down, it flared with time. And this had consequences. The animals could not learn, the rats could not remember, and it got worse with time, a bit like what happens with humans, so it's a good model. Now the good news is that my colleague Chiquetto was able to suppress some of these bad things, like the growth of the volume of the stroke, like the inflammation, by giving anti-inflammatory agents. And now we're working very closely together with a colleague in Montreal who is actually looking to see whether what we found in animals is true in people. And so far, it looks as if we're on the right track. And that is that he found, this is Alex Steele from Montreal, that the amount of amyloid in the cortex, the rind of the brain, was a better predictor of how intelligent or cognitively intact people would be at 6 months than the initial assessment of their cognitive powers. Now that was interesting, but it was not surprising to us because we expected that. What we did not expect, and it's really very encouraging, is that there was a better relationship between the amount of inflammation in the white matter of the brain and cognitive status at 6 months than the initial cognitive status. This means that inflammation is one of the causes that makes people get worse or develop Alzheimer's disease after a stroke. And of course, if we can use anti-inflammatory agents at the right time, in the right dose, for the right people, because not everyone may benefit, then we may be able to either prevent or delay or mitigate the type of dementia that occurs after a stroke, because 20% of people who had a stroke will end up dementia 3 months. And it isn't simply the damage caused by the stroke to the brain, because sometimes it's just a single stroke. Some of them act as if they had been tipped over into Alzheimer's disease, just like in our animals. So clearly we discovered a link between stroke and Alzheimer's disease that may be treatable. And we are working very hard to prove this as soon as possible, because we're working very closely together. So having observed what happens in people, we're going back to the laboratory and exploring exactly where is the inflammation, the white matter, which drug would help at what time, in what dose. Now, some years ago, I began thinking whether the usual approach, which is you wait till somebody develops the symptoms, then you make a diagnosis, and then you try to treat it, whether simply trying to identify the vascular component, which is treatable in all dementias, wouldn't be the way to go. Because it turns out, from the same study I mentioned to you, the 6,205 people, that if you have changes of Alzheimer's disease, and then you have a stroke, it doubles the chances of developing Alzheimer's disease. And by this I mean you could have the pathological changes, the senile plaques, the neofibrillary tangles of tau protein, and you can go through life having those and nothing happens to you. But if you also have a stroke, it doubles the chance that those lesions that a lot of us have without knowing it tips you into Alzheimer's disease. So therefore I suggested that we should begin looking at the whole spectrum, not just in dementia at the end stage, but any cognitive impairment that is related to vascular risk factors or vascular components, because we can treat that, we can prevent that. The other point is that, unfortunately, doctors get into a room, they have big discussions, they develop criteria and said, okay, we're going to call Alzheimer's disease if they have A, B, C, D, E, F. It turns out we don't know enough to define these so-called Alzheimer's disease. And I'm saying so-called because in real life, most older people have vascular lesions, so they have Alzheimer's lesions, and sometimes the lesions that lead to Parkinson's disease. It's the combination that's bad. And we have to begin to define better based on information, not simply a bunch of experts getting together and trying to capture reality. There is a Canadian band called Rush, and it says you can bend perceptions, but reality won't budge. And reality is not budging. We have to acknowledge ignorance as a form of knowledge. And in 2006, a woman called Gabrielle Leblanc from the National Institute of Health of the United States and myself organized an international meeting to define, if you're going to study someone who has some difficulty with thinking or their memory, then we should use the same data points so that we can compare what we are describing in one study, what is described in another study. At the moment, there are 6 different types of criteria. And you can imagine that if you describe one type of criteria, you cannot compare it to the other. We cannot build on the common knowledge. And this is being done now. What we suggest is being tested in the United States, in Canada, in Singapore, in Korea, South Korea, and in Hong Kong that I'm aware of. So clearly we're moving towards sort of saying, okay, let's start from the beginning. Let's have a standard way of describing it. Let's have a common language. Now the really important point, and this is one that I want you to remember, is that the same risk factors that make you prone to develop a stroke also make you likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. And the good news is, most of them are treatable. I will not go into details because most of these are known to you. High blood pressure, heart disease, high cholesterol, obesity, diabetes, smoking, high levels of homocysteine, stress, depression. And then on the other hand, there are things that actually benefit you, like high education, physical activity, active lifestyle. This is New Zealand, so I don't dare say don't drink. But and having savored some of your Sauvignons, I'm not about to advocate it. The point here is that I would not advise anyone to take up drinking alcohol to protect themselves. Although there is, again, I can give you the explanation afterwards, but I'm going to make a statement of fact. To get a benefit, a woman shouldn't drink more than one drink a day, and that could be a beer or a hard drink or a serving of wine. And men can do 2. And I'm not saying that because I'm a man. It's just that they're physically more able to metabolize alcohol. Now, if it's 2 for a woman and 3 for a man, it's a bit of a washout. I mean, you're not causing harm, you're not having benefit. Beyond that, it's actually harmful. And it has been calculated in the United States that for each one person that you help avoid a stroke or help towards having dementia, you're really harming the rest of the people because alcohol is addictive, the other consequences. So again, to have it with a meal, with the wonderful wines that you have in this country, absolutely is a good thing. But again, be aware that there's the downside. And then, of course, if AFib is a highly treatable condition, and if that is diagnosed, of course, then that can be treated very successfully. Now, and by the way, usually, if you follow the media, if you read the papers, if you go on the internet, every week there's something's either good for you or bad for you. So how do you tell? Well, my suggestion is that for in New Zealand, I've listed the risk factors. There are reliable sources. The Stroke Foundation of New Zealand. I mean, it's their business to look at the data, to get the experts and give the best advice. And so I think that's the source. And people who promise easy cures, drink this herbal tea 3 times a day, were laced with a bit of arsenic or whatever else they add. And I'm not kidding. Some of the herbal, I'm not here to trash herbal treatments. I'm simply saying that the difference between what physicians do and what's advocated in these health stores is that the medical people have to prove that what they advocate is accurate. There's no such restriction, at least in Canada, for things that are sold over the counter and for advocating miracle outcomes. Now, the risk factors are very well known. The thing that is not very well known, and this slide took me more time than any other that I prepared because I had to read so much in different types of literature, the Alzheimer literature, experimental literature. But anyway, the main point here, I don't want you to pay attention to everything in particular, but the point I want to make is that the risk factors that I outlined make the tau protein and amyloid protein deposition in the brain accelerate. In other words, you have high blood pressure. It's not only bad for your blood vessels, it also is bad because there's increased deposition of amyloid, which eventually could lead to Alzheimer's disease. So it's important to control the risk factors for their own sake to prevent heart disease, to prevent stroke, to prevent kidney disease. But it's also important because it slows the process that may end up as being Alzheimer's disease. Oh, okay, it's the evening, and so I'm not really sure about your alertness, so I'm going to make you alert by asking you questions. Now, I'm talking about the risk factor control, blood pressure control, doing things that can be boring, or require a lot of self-restraint. And I have said nothing about genes, about genetics, and we all know there's some people who have good genes and some people who have bad genes. And one of the worst genes that has been identified is called ApoE4. If people have the ApoE4 gene, they're more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. They're likely to have it earlier. They're likely to have it more severely. Now, if you were to, and also that if you have a risk factor and you have ApoE4, it makes the risk much greater. So how many of you, if you knew that you had an ApoE4, would say, to heck with all this dieting and all this, don't drink wine, don't stay up, do all this boring exercise. How many of you would say, to heck with it, I will enjoy life? Let me see a show of hands. Oh my good. Oh yes, sir. Okay, two. Oh, all right. Okay. So some people will live it up. How many would say, oh my God, the odds are against me, I better be as careful as I can, I will exercise every day, I'll watch my diet, etc. How many of you do that? Oh my goodness. Wow, what a good group. I would like to have your patience. You would actually follow what I suggest. Well, I'll have to get a license to come back here. Well, let me share the facts with you. First, I want you to look at the midlife high blood pressure E4 negative. That's E4. And it tells you that if you have high blood pressure in midlife, then you're more than twice as likely to be demented or develop dementia later in life. And then if you look at the lower column, if you have then ApoE4 and also have high blood pressure, the chances of developing Alzheimer's disease or dementia in later life is 10 times as high as if they did not have the gene, they did not have high blood pressure. Oh my God, right? But I want you now to go shift back to the left column, like the one that says yes. However, if the blood pressure is treated, then the risk of developing dementia is not much higher than if they did not have the ApoE4 at all. So it looks as if you have the wrong gene. It magnifies the risk if you have a risk factor, but by the same token, you gain greater benefit by controlling it. So the majority of you who would really look after yourselves are on the right track. It's worth it, particularly if you have the wrong gene. Now the same is true now for alcohol drinking, and I already mentioned that small amounts are good for you, large amounts are bad for you. The same is true for physical inactivity. Physically inactive people have the ApoE4, the risk is much greater. If they exercise, it's about the same as someone who does not have the gene. But the big difficulty is that when we're talking about controlling risk factors and doing the protective things like exercise, you're talking about changing human behavior. And I always like to ask my audiences, in their experience, what is likely to change human behavior? It's an open question. Have you seen people change their behavior for the better? I don't mean for the worse, I mean for the better. Or just change. Have you ever been a teenager? Have you ever fallen in love? Wasn't that the most radical change in your behavior since you were an adult? But I'm actually talking about love, and I love it, not the erotic love necessarily, although that works. I'm talking about what the Greeks call agape. In other words, the love of family, the love of friends, the commitment to your friends. And that's really very powerful. And from my own experience, I fell on the ice some years ago. I ripped out a tendon in my left shoulder. I had it operated on. And I was assigned a physiotherapist. He was a small man, 5'3". I'm 6'2", and big boned. And he worked very hard. And he gave me these elastic, I don't know what they were, elastic bands, yellow, orange, and red. I've forgotten which is the stronger one. But anyway, it's supposed to do all these boring exercises. And I thought to myself, I will not be using, whatever natural movement I have, I'll use, so I don't have to do their exercise. I'm not going to be throwing in javelins in the Olympics, so forget it. Anyway, he would say, Doctor, have you done your exercises? I didn't have the heart to tell him I didn't. So I did. And look at my shoulders, perfect, right? So if you make a commitment to someone, then it makes a difference. So based on that principle, that we will do, it's easy to do it together. Like if people exercise, if you have someone to exercise with, to run, to walk, you're more likely to do it. If you want to quit smoking, you're much likely to be successful if someone else is also trying to quit. So based on that, some years ago, we did a pilot study whereby we took patients in the stroke prevention clinic who had a warning of a stroke or a mild stroke, and we either gave them the usual care, which was that that the family doctor would get a letter from us advising what to do, or they would work with a nurse in addition to having the family physician get the letter, or work with a layperson. And this study was done with a nurse called Cheryl Meyer and a younger colleague called Richard Chan. And my colleague, the nurse, she couldn't conceive that a layperson could be giving advice to a patient. She thought that was unprofessional and should not be done. And I confessed to blackmail. I said, Cheryl, you want the nurse thing? We'll have to try the volunteer thing. All right. It wasn't as bad as I say. It wasn't really blackmail, but I'm trying to express to you that we should be thinking more broadly, that many of the things that professionals do, like doctors and nurses do, you can do for yourself, or your family can do for you, or you can do together. This is my point, because a lot of the things that need to be done can be done with the backup of professionals, but it can be done by lay people, volunteers. So we actually did a pilot study, and we found a very strong, so if you, usual care, sending a letter to the family doctor, did not change very much control of risk factors. If, in addition, a nurse was working with a patient, then it was better. There was a trend towards being helpful. But the most dramatic thing was if a lay person, usually of the same sex and age, worked with that person, there was a dramatic trend in favor of better blood pressure control and weight control. So based on that pilot study, we're now doing a Canada-wide study to find out the answer, whether working with a volunteer helps you control risk factors and decreases the number of strokes and decreases the likelihood of developing dementia. We'll finish entering patients at the end of June of this year. We'll have the answer in 2 years, and please invite me back. We'll have to come back and tell you the results. Now, I'm going to get personal now. What must you do? And I do use must deliberately. If you want to give the best chance of preventing having a stroke or having dementia, what must you do? You must know the symptoms of stroke. If you have the symptoms, you don't have time to Google, all right? You must memorize them. Please do. If you go home tonight, if you don't know them, Google and do learn them. That's your task. Secondly, you must control your risk factors. And again, there's good advice now. They now have apps that will give you encouragement. If you can find someone else to do it with, that's so much the better. Ideally with a spouse or a friend or someone else. And of course, persuade your family and your friends to do the same. Because I think they're more likely to do it if it comes from you. I'm afraid that most families have been touched either by stroke or dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And that's an incentive to sort of say, look, we don't know what the odds are, but we do know we can change those odds now by doing these things. And again, I know you're going to Google tonight, but I'll give you a head start on what symptoms to know, just like that you must know either if you have them or someone else has them, because this is an emergency. This is a brain attack, a term I suggested some years ago. There's a sudden loss of speech, and I do mean sudden, like that. I don't mean over a pie, I mean like that. The same goes for sudden weakness of the face, arm, or leg, or sudden numbness in the face, arm, or leg, sudden loss of vision in one or both eyes, sudden staggering, and sudden double vision. Now, if the symptoms go away, it doesn't mean the danger is away. These are emergencies. You go straight to the nearest hospital. And in some cities like mine, 340,000 inhabitants, they go to one hospital, the university hospital, because the sooner you get there, the better the chance of treatment. Now, I remind you again about the risk factors. And I don't want to take the time to go over what some of the other things are that could help or not help. because most of the other things, like should you drink coffee or not, etc., are observational studies. In other words, they observe that people who drink coffee are a little bit better off. But then you don't know who's drinking coffee. I mean, are these people who are healthy otherwise, who don't drink alcohol, who exercise? That's the problem with so-called observational studies. Now, when I finished medical school, I did not have one gray hair. Look at me now, right? So it's all, I think it's because I became a doctor, see? It's a common fallacy. Just because something happens from one time to the other doesn't mean that it's caused by it. So a lot of these reports you see every week is good for you, bad for you. They are so-called observational studies. The best test for any treatment is what we call randomized trials. In other words, half the people get the treatment we think works, the other one do not, and then you compare them. And you're going to highlight two of the important things that have been proven to be effective. This is not theory now, this is science. One of them is physical exercise, and the other one is diet. So I'll just linger for a minute on exercise. Again, if you go to the Stroke Foundation of New Zealand, I'm sure they have recommendations. They're pretty well the same around the world. 30 minutes of moderate exercise 5 times a week. If you exercise more, you get more benefit, but you have to spend more time exercising. So if you like exercising, do more. If not, do the basics. That's enough to keep you healthy. And of course, you have to do not only aerobic exercise, you have to do some weights, you have to do things that strengthen the bone. But anyway, I wanted to emphasize the point that there's no controversy about exercise. This is now proven. It's good for the body and it's good for the mind. And again, when it comes to diet, there is one diet that has been proven, and that's the Mediterranean diet. As you can see, they're heavy on olive oil. I tasted some wonderful olive oil here in New Zealand. So you have the ingredients: mixed nuts, fruit, vegetables, fish, wine, whole grain. I mean, you have all of this. You're ideally suited to follow this diet. Now, it may be that other diets also work, but I'm just identifying the ones that, in my opinion, have achieved a high standard of scientific proof. So keep in mind that you can do a lot for yourselves. Now, I have said what you must do to increase your chances of having a healthy brain and physical life. Now I'm going to suggest what you can do, because we need to change not only ourselves, but our communities if we're going to live in a healthy world. And one of the things I suggest is you participate in World Stroke Day. It happens on October 29th, and there are hundreds of activities around the world where people usually get into some sort of program, an educational program, or they get checkups on their blood pressure. There are also some imaginative things that are done. Secondly, support brain organizations, and I think I'd like to put a plug in for the Neurological Foundation, because I visited their headquarters and their research facilities in Auckland, and I think they use the money wisely, and I think we need to do much more, and I think one of the ways you can help is help the people who are trying to find the answers, find them, because it concerns all of us. And then the other thing is that, most of us are not involved at the political level. However, a lot of the things that do work have to be done at the community, at the state level, even internationally. For example, smoking. Smoking has been suppressed in many countries because of legislation, forbidding it for smoking in restaurants. The other thing, now the big battle is sugar drinks and fast foods, etc. So there are things, again, they're never easy solutions, but you can get involved. I mean, one of the issues about fast foods is that healthy foods are more expensive. Well, there are solutions to that. And again, in a country like yours, you have access to both. So you perhaps can serve as a model for other parts of the world of what can be done to have healthier lifestyles. Actually, this is something that I designed. I was the person who actually started the World Stroke Day, and I'm delighted how it's really taken off. Obviously, there was a need for it. And I was thrilled when 2 years ago, in Brazil, they decided that at the finals of their soccer games, of course they're crazy about soccer, as you know, later this month is going to be the World Cup. And so at intermission, they had all these players come out with these big placards saying 90% of strokes are preventable. And the other thing that I was really very pleased about is that when I was editor of the journal Stroke, which is the leading publication in the field, I got together sort of all the experts in stroke and most of the experts in the world, because we're still a small community of those who are interested in stroke. And we developed the world agenda for stroke. And then about 4 years ago, I was asked to advise the Brazilian government on what they should do about stroke, because it's the leading cause of death and disability in Brazil. And so they ended up last year of adopting a national stroke policy. And to my delight, one of the source documents is that very document we produced to advise what the priority should be. So again, I'm not aware that whether you have a national policy, stroke policy, or dementia policy, but that's happening. Many European countries now have a few have a stroke policy, like Spain, but a number of them have an Alzheimer and a dementia policy. First in France, now in Britain. So I think it does, and I think what I really like to see is an integrated plan, because as I've tried to explain to you, the two conditions are related, and some of the risk factors are the same. And you may be aware that in 2011, the United Nations General Assembly, for the second time in its history, had a declaration for non-communicable diseases. The first one was on AIDS, and that ended up being very successful, because now AIDS is contained. It's no longer expanding, and overall, in the places where treatment has been implemented, it's actually falling. So that was successful. In September of 2011, they declared 4 conditions that they wanted to target. One is cardiovascular, heart disease and stroke, cancer, diabetes, and pulmonary disease. And they emphasized again that they have common risk factors: unhealthy diets, high in salt, sugar, trans fats, physical activity, alcohol, and tobacco. And so again, the recurrent theme that by doing some simple things we can have a great impact. Now, one thing that troubled me was that it was a brainless agenda. Apart from stroke, which does involve the mind, there was no identification of the brain itself. So I was president of the World Federation of Neurology at the time, which encompasses about 190 national societies, including the New Zealand Neurological Society, which is now joined with the Australian. But then I thought that my voice would be stronger if I got all the brain organizations of the world to speak with the same voice. And we developed a document based on 3 premises. The first one is that brain health is key to health and wellness. Secondly, that brain health and health begin with the mother and the child and their education, and our brains are our future. You have to have a greater intelligence now to even manage in the digital age. The people who used to work with their muscles, there are fewer and fewer jobs for that. If they're mechanical jobs in a factory, robots do that. So even to do humble jobs, you have to be able to handle computers, be numerical. And again, most of the advances are going to come from what's called the knowledge-based society. So for our own futures, we need to have a good brain and be better educated. Now, let me move towards the end of my lecture, and then of course we're open for question, and that is, if we were to do the things I'm advocating, could we make a difference? Well, for stroke, the answer is yes, we know that. And I want you to look at this blue triangle. In developed countries, we've been able to cut the incidence, in other words, the number of cases per 100,000 in half. Regretfully, in developing countries, the numbers have doubled. And in part it is because developing countries are adopting the Western style of living. They are moving from the country to the cities. They're not exercising. They're eating fast foods. It's a place where they can gain addictions to alcohol, marijuana, whatever else is offered in cities. And unfortunately, the trend there is the opposite. Now, we have observed perhaps the most dramatic change in what we call atherosclerosis of the large vessels. And we knew in 1985, for example, if somebody had a blood vessel, the carotid arteries, the two main arteries in the front of the neck, had a narrowing, then we knew that each year 3.5% of them would end up having a stroke. Now that we can treat blood pressure, can treat high cholesterol, can treat other things, the risk is only 0.5%. That's pretty dramatic. And so we don't have to do surgery in these cases anymore because the surgery is more dangerous than treating them medically. Now, the next question is there any evidence that doing the things that I'm advocating will make a difference? Well, there's some indirect evidence. There have been 2 articles published recently, one from Sweden and one from Holland, where the rates at which people develop dementia has dropped, has decreased. Now, we don't know all the reasons for that, but since I explained to you that stroke contributes to dementia, and that most dementia have a big vascular component, doesn't it make sense that a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're controlling the risk factors better? The problem is that there has not been a single study devoted specifically to do the things that I'm advocating. Why? Because stroke doctors do stroke trials, Alzheimer doctors do Alzheimer trials. What we need to do is studies that try to prevent stroke and prevent or delay Alzheimer's disease. Now, I'm optimistic. Why? Because 50 years ago, the mean age of onset of heart failure was 56. Now, it's 76. Can you imagine the number of lives saved, the productivity retained, the life enjoyed? Now, can we, and the other important thing is that if we can delay the onset of dementia by 1 year, we'll cut the prevalence by 20%. If we shifted 5 years, we'll cut the numbers in half, because people end up dying from multiple things, not from dementia. So the point is not to live forever. The point is to push disease to the end of life. So when the kidneys go, and the knees go, and the brain goes, it's time to go. Now, will we be able to delay the onset of dementia, of brain failure, as we have heart failure? I don't know, but we're sure trying, because our brains depend on it. Thank you. Thank you. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Hachinski. I'm sure everyone has got some questions. You've raised so many interesting points this evening, given us a lot to think about. We will move the microphone around the room. If we could just limit, I know there's so many questions, but if we could just limit one question per person, please. See someone down the back here.
Hi, I'm Brian. Just a quick question. There's a strong belief that taking low doses of aspirin will help in preventing blood disease like you described.
Right. Well, first of all, aspirin is a wonderful drug. And if people have symptoms or heart disease, it should be given. Now, on the question of should you take an aspirin a day to keep the doctors away? No. And the reason is that if you take aspirin, if you're otherwise well, you have no risk factors, your doctor doesn't think you should have it, then taking it will prevent some strokes in women and some heart attacks in men. But the price is bleeding. So the best advice is get advice. In other words, I wouldn't simply take it because it's a good idea. It may not be a good idea. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we are working very hard on the possibility that anti-inflammatory agents, and aspirin is one of them, could have a benefit. But then there's a question of what dose, when, and who should take it. It's a good question because it's a common belief. It's a very powerful drug, by the way. If aspirin were introduced today, it would not be sold over the counter.
I'm not exactly sure if this question fits in with what you're doing, but I have had Bell's palsy in the past and was told that was like a facial stroke. Does that fit into the type of stroke that you have been talking about tonight?
No, it isn't. It's totally different.
Okay.
It's an inflammation of the nerve, the facial nerve, the nerve that goes into the face. Nothing to do with stroke at all, or dementia, or Alzheimer's disease.
Thank you.
You're lucky. And I see you're smiling, so you've recovered. By the way, there are no stupid questions. They're just stupid answers, and I'll try to avoid those.
I think most of us don't know much about homocysteine. Is it important? Should we do something about it? Can we do something about it? What do we do?
That's an excellent question. First, what we know for sure. High levels of homocysteine are associated with more strokes and more dementia, actually. And the reason is that high homocysteine levels increase the deposition of tau protein that I mentioned earlier. So the relationship between high levels and having strokes and having dementia is established. That's not in dispute. There have been studies, and the studies have been equivocal. And the reason probably is that oftentimes the treatment is vitamins, vitamin B12. And it has been given as a compound that has a toxic element to it, cobalamin. In other words, it's one that actually is harmful. So some of the beneficial effects are probably negated by the side effects. And there is a new version of the vitamin that does not have that toxic component, and maybe using that medication would be helpful. But to come back to specifics before we know the final definitive answer, I think it is an individual thing. If it's very high, the doctors probably would recommend treating it anyway, even before the evidence is in, because it could be dangerous. If the levels are not very high, they're sort of borderline, probably is best not to. But at the moment, we don't have a definite answer as to whether the treatment makes a difference. And notice how careful I am in answering the question, because, the difference between a scientist and those on what I call merchants of hope, they're always sure. I would have said, yes, and as it happens, we have a sale here. We will give you not only that, but some other vitamins. And I have that, So I think one has to be very careful, because if you have, it has been said that for every complex problem, there's a simple solution: plausible, compelling, and wrong. So, but those are good questions, though, because that's one of the issues that's not been settled. But probably, when the evidence is in, I suspect that we will be treating higher levels of homocysteine.
Could you take this business of the aspirin just a wee bit further? Some people, as a lot of the population, after one reason or other, been on aspirin for years, develop some one or two attacks of atrial fibrillation. Should they then transfer over onto your anticoagulants, the stronger anticoagulants, or just accept that aspirin's enough?
Aspirin is not enough. Let me give you the statistics. Aspirin, in doses of 325, which is the normal adult dose, will decrease the risk of having a stroke by 25%. The anticoagulants will decrease it by 2/3. So if somebody has AFib, for sure, that's the better treatment. Again, I was dogmatic here. How about that? I'm not being dogmatic. I mean, there'd be exceptions, but in general, that is the drug of choice. And I mentioned earlier that there are 4 others. Some of them have been approved. A couple of them have been approved in Canada. The advantage of the new ones is that you don't have to have your blood checked, and you don't have to be so careful about what you eat, because if you have anticoagulants, you have to watch what you eat. However, the disadvantage is that if if people bleed with the new anticoagulants, we haven't learned how to stop it, whereas we can stop bleeding and people taking anticoagulants who give vitamin K. So again, it's nice to go with the new, it's nice to have an alternative, but I think one has to be also cautious that new is not necessarily best.
I'll have two questions now because there's another point to take before. I've read the history of the discovery of aspirin as an agent to reduce heart attacks and strokes. And you're quite right, the original tests were all done as 300 milligrams. If you are prescribed aspirin by the GP in New Zealand, it will always be either 100 milligrams or 80 milligrams low dose, coated.
Right.
I have queried that with the medicos as to why the original studies were done with 300 and now the usual dose given to people is 100. Any thoughts on that?
I do have thoughts, and I'll divide, well, first I'll give you the facts and I'll give you my opinion. Well, the facts are that the only dose of aspirin that has been shown to prevent stroke and atrial fibrillation is 325. So therefore, that's the dose. Now, a number of times when we first see a patient who's had a stroke, we don't know the cause. And so we, by we I mean in my center, we use 325 for stroke. I have no opinion as to whether lower doses are effective for the heart. Now, those are facts. Now I'll go to speculation. Now, for each adult dose of aspirin, you can get 4 baby aspirins. The popular ones in Canada are 81 milligrams. So if you divide something, if instead of you have one pill, you divide it into 4, and you get 5 times the price for each of the pieces than you do for the whole thing. Sounds like good business to me. But I'm not suggesting, by the way, having said that, I wonder about that. But it may be that for heart disease or other conditions that the lower dose is just as good, but I go by what we know, and that is 325 works for stroke prevention.
The word stroke is an interesting word to use for this cerebrovascular accident.
Yes?
Any idea how it came about?
I'm sorry?
The word stroke.
Yes.
How did that come about as a word to use for this condition?
Yes.
Do you have any idea?
Yes, I do actually. I do. Well, stroke is stricken by the hand of God, as if you've done something evil. And it sounds even worse in German. Schlaganfall. Don't you feel guilty? All right. That's the origin. Now, the first word that was actually used widely was apoplexy, which is Greek, which again has the same application. Something happens to you suddenly. So that's the origin of the word stroke. Now, the word cerebrovascular accident is not a very good term either, because John Norris and I wrote a book on acute stroke, and we said typically they say CVA, which is supposed to stand for cerebrovascular accident. And I have objected to that because strokes are not accidents, they're preventable catastrophes. And I prefer the term brain attack because that means if something's happening to your brain, you better have it looked at. Now, some of the time, if something happens to you suddenly, it's not a stroke, but it is something that needs immediate attention. And so, for a lay person, I prefer brain attack, and then once you make the diagnosis, you say it's either an ischemic attack due to closure of blood vessel or hemorrhagic due to rupture of a vessel, as I explained.
Thank you. Any other questions?
There was a question here, Bridget.
Now, this is not directly within the scope of your talk tonight, but you may have a comment. I was wondering, is there any established or research link between ECT treatments, say when someone's in their 30s and 40s, and a later dementia?
I'm not aware of any. And in fact, this is brain stimulation. That's coming back. Actually, brain stimulation appears to be a good thing for a number of conditions, not only depression, but brain recovery. There's a whole literature. Now the dosage that's given is a bit different. It's less and it's more focused. I don't know about a link between having received the ECT treatments. Now there is a link though, however, between depression, late life depression, not early on, but late life depression, and the likelihood of dementia. There is a relationship. But again, a relation doesn't mean that's a given. It's just that the probability is a bit higher, but it's not destiny. Depressed people are not destined to become demented. It's just that a slightly higher proportion of them will end up with dementia.
You mentioned halfway through your talk an anti-inflammatory that was sometimes administered to people that had suffered a stroke. I wonder if you could give us more information about that.
Yes, we're trying that in a laboratory. Now, we have tried a number of things. Aspirin, by the way, has some benefit on our animal work, but it's not very powerful. We have used them, we're trying them systematically to see what works best in the laboratory, and then we'll pilot it in humans. And the whole idea is to then do a multi-center trial in humans. We don't have that answer, and no one else does either. In fact, we're the only ones who are actually bringing this on, because in the past there have been trials where people take anti-inflammatory agents, and some studies say yes, it helps, some say it doesn't. It probably means that you cannot expect that a single dose of a particular drug late in dementia will make a difference, because the brain is so damaged already.
Thank you. I think we've probably got time for one more.
Hello.
Yes?
My name is Marion. Back to aspirins again. Is it true that if you've had a stroke, that it's good to have one in your handbag and you take it immediately?
To do what?
To always carry aspirin with you.
Yes, good idea. Good idea. Yes.
You take it immediately.
Excellent question. Glad you brought it up. Yes. Always carry aspirin with you. And if something happens to you, if you have chest pain, or if you get one of those symptoms, crush it and put it under your tongue and swallow it and call for help. It is helpful for heart attacks. As a matter of fact, I saved the life of a colleague that way, not personally, but indirectly. He came to see me because he had a warning of a stroke, and then and he did fine. And then I told him to just what I said to you now. And it turns out that he's a famous Canadian physician, very hardworking, and not a very good patient, may I say. However, it turns out that his wife went to bed, and then he went to bed. He stayed late, and then she realized that he wasn't in bed. So she went down there, and he looked, as she described, at death won over. So what he had done, he didn't want to bother her. He went down there, took his aspirin, and he was having a heart attack. So that was probably enough to gain him time before the ambulance came and did an urgent, angioplasty. And after the angioplasty, they had surgery and did well. But then I said, well, Kyle, you won't know his last name. I said, how come that you took the aspirin? I said, well, you told me to. I was very surprised that he actually paid attention, because it's but it saved his life. I mean, he was told that. So a good idea, and I'm glad you brought it up, because it's very practical. I carry an aspirin, by the way. I do.
And 18 milligrams?
No, the full dose. And I'm taking 2 won't harm you. I mean, if there's carry 2. One for you and one for a friend. That was probably the most practical question asked. I mean, this could make a difference to some of us. Yes, sir.
Stroke was from hemorrhage, and you take the aspirin?
Pardon?
If you have a stroke and you take the aspirin, and the stroke is from a hemorrhage rather than from a thrombus?
Yes, it won't do that much harm. It won't make it that much different. And most of the odds are that it's going to be an ischemic anyway. And if it's a hemorrhagic one, it doesn't make that much difference. There was a study done actually in China, a very large study, and that's what they showed, that for practical purposes, given the danger from a ischemic stroke versus a possible worsening of hemorrhagic one, it's still in favor of the aspirin. And as we mentioned earlier, it's of course very important for heart disease, which is even more common than strokes.
Thank you. It's been some great questions. Thank you to agree, Professor Hachinski. Thank you very much for coming along, and thank you, Professor Hachinski, for a very interesting talk tonight. We do appreciate you coming along, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your stay here in the South Island. And please pass on our regards to Mary, who's not here this evening. And a very special thank you also to our volunteers who have worked all over the place this evening, Marianne and her band of merry workers. Thank you. And thank you for everyone for coming along this evening. It's been a very enjoyable evening, and I think we'll probably go away with more questions and get Googling when we get home. So please join with me now and thank Professor. I could just sort of add one last thing before everybody runs away home. Our next event here in Queenstown with the Wakatipu U3A is on Monday, the 24th of March at the Queenstown Event Centre. The Neurological Foundation's medical advisor, Dr. John Simcock, will be here with us from Auckland. Some of you may have met him before. That'll be a very interesting day. He'll present his insights on brain disorders, progress and prospects. And all details should be on the flyers available outside. So thank you again to Professor Hachinski, and good night, and thank you for the Neurological Foundation.